Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to Flad. It's a pleasure to have you here for another session of Meet the Author, where we have the pleasure to receive Tess Gunty, that she will be talking to us about her new book, The Rabbit Hutch, that won the National Book Award 2022. I would also like to thank Penguin for being, as always, such a good partner with Flad in this organization, and I hope that you enjoy the conversation. And of course, I also want to thank Isabel Lucas for being the great organizer of this series and also for being the person that conducts the conversation. Thank you all, and I hope that you enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Tess, for being here. I just will present very briefly Tess Gunty. Tess Gunty was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. The town, it's the inspiration for Vaca Val. Vaca Val, it's a fictional name of a post-industrial place where she sets her debut novel, The Rabbit Hutch, in Portuguese, O Contrário de Nada, livro traduzido pela Eugénia Antunes, muito bem traduzido pela Eugénia Antunes, que está algures por ali. Translated by Eugénia. Tess's novel starts from a real base to deal with some of today's main obsessions and problems in a town that brings together great diversity of characters and belies most of the cliches normally associated with Midwest. It's dark, it's satirical, it's caricatural, it challenges notions such as normality or correctness. It's challenging, it's unsettling, and it's beautifully written. It won the National Book Award in 2022. Before that, the book was rejected by many publishers who thought it was very weird. Jonathan Safran Foer, a great writer that you all must know, tried to convince Tess to insist and convince some of editors and publishers to read the novel, and that's why we are here today. Thank you, Jonathan Safran, for that. And so we are here with the author, with an author whose main inspiration is poetry, especially since she started reading T.S. Eliot, but who is also moved and adorned by the prose of someone like David Foster Wallace. So she's difficult to classify as a writer, and thank God for that, because we are very tired of writers that are very easily classified. Tess, I'll invite you to read a passage from the novel. Can you tell us what you are reading?
Well, first I just want to thank you, and thanks to everyone who worked to coordinate this event. Thank you to my translator and to my publisher. It's such a privilege. It's really the biggest joy of publishing a novel, to meet readers around the world and get to learn from you. So thank you, and thank you. I'm going to read from a passage that is from the chapter called Variables. I changed my mind about what I was going to read. And it's about a relationship that's developing between a 40-year-old teacher and a 17-year-old student at the school. And he's directing a play that she's in. So this is one night after rehearsal, when he thinks the students have left. James sits at the upright piano in the music room and plays the first movement of a Maurice Ravel suite. Tiffany is still there. James's subconscious knows she is there. James's subconscious no longer considers Tiffany a student. She stands several yards away, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her baggy blue uniform. With her fair skin, white hair, and purple-shadowed eyes, she looks like she's been dead for days. When the suite ends, James catches Tiffany staring at him, her expression revealing something akin to fear. Gaspard de la Nuit, says James, clearing his throat. Took me 7 years to learn. Gaspard? She asks. It means something like treasurer of the night. That was long, she says. What was? The suite. Oh yeah, 7 minutes. So you learned a minute a year, she asks. Well, that was just the first movement. There are actually 2 more, all based on the fantasies of this French poet named Aloysius Bertrand, published in the early 1800s, I think. He cracks his knuckles. You'd love the poetry, surreal as hell. Never succeeded in its time. Never succeeded at all, actually. You take French, right? Or Latin? Les deux. My translation has French on one side of the page, English on the other. I'll lend you my copy. And what was that, she asks. What was what? The movement you just played. Oh, he says, it's called Ondine. It's about a mermaid seducing a mortal. Embarrassed by the thematic relevance which had not occurred to him until he said it out loud, James scrambles to other facts, flexing his music theory degree. He maunders on louder and louder, but Tiffany says nothing. To get himself to shut up, he retrieves a pair of headphones from his bag and crosses the room to her. It's something to do. Do you have headphones already, he asks. He knows that she doesn't. Tiffany keeps her eyes on the piano, as though she's afraid it might spring to life. Why? My daughter spilled juice on my laptop, so I had to get a replacement yesterday, says James. They had a deal for teachers. Buy a laptop, get headphones. Take them, I'm serious, I got them for free. Well, what about you, she asks. I have others, he says. Do you have better ones, she asks. Yes. When their hands touch, Tiffany hardly feels it, because it seems to her that they've been touching for weeks. James feels it and withdraws at once. Then James marches to the piano and collects his bag. Excuse me, he says professionally, almost angrily, as he pushes past her. She exits the room as he flicks off the light and locks the door. For a moment, they hesitate in the dark hallway. After hours, the entire high school feels like a set to Tiffany, insisting on the fraudulence of everything that occurs there. The sports, the calculations, the dissections, the assemblies on drunk driving, the fire drills, the chicken tenders, the gossip, the imitation friendships. Nothing counts. It's all Sudoku, a controlled experiment, a relentless series of practice tests. Tiffany conceives of her peers as baby predators, biting and scratching in the den while their mother hunts. She wants something, anything, to count, but is also emboldened by the conviction that nothing possibly can. I'll stop there.
These conversations occurs in Vacaville, the place that you created, a kind of fictional town. I remember always, of course, Faulkner's place in the south. I think of this Vacaville of a kind of Midwestern fictional place to congregs all of the differences and that makes a town, and help us to not to think in the Midwest as the way we used to think, a cliche. What moves you to create this fictional town and not put this place, this action in your real small town?
Well, one of the motivations is that I wanted the freedom to pull from many towns that had suffered a similar economic history. So that I wanted to kind of create an almost patchwork of places. But I also wanted the freedom to create a kind of mythical, folkloric, unstable, slightly shimmering context. I wanted it to be a few degrees removed from reality. And I knew that if I set it in a real town, I would feel too beholden to accuracy, and I think sometimes you can compromise truth for accuracy, and I didn't want to do that.
And this Vacaville is there is a lot of diversity in there. Can you tell us what was your main goal to put all this diversity in that kind of places? Because I used to think that there are people who works in middle class, poor middle class, angry with the country, that votes Trump. I don't know. This Vacaville, it's nothing like that. It's different.
Right. I mean, I think I wanted to create a place that felt more expansive, more true to the context that I knew growing up, which were full of different ideologies, different kinds of concerns, and different different political systems, different, certainly different preoccupations and personalities. And I think I often say this, but it's because it's the best way I know how to describe this kind of novel that I kept being drawn to around the time that I tried to write this, which was a novel with several storylines, several voices. These polyphonic novels operate more like ecosystems. And of course, a healthy ecosystem is diverse. So I wanted to invite people, many different kinds of people and voices and concerns into the text. Also to disrupt some of the flattening preconceptions about this area of America.
Mm-hmm. And we start with a character named Belinda, and with a death. We know that there is somebody dies and Belinda dies. It's not a spoiler, but we know also that this girl deals with a kind of obsession. She loves the female mystics, Catholic mystics. Mm-hmm. And you, in your epigraph, you start also with one of those mystics, Hildegard de Bingen. Can you tell us why did you choose this kind of character to make a complex portrait of kind of America, I guess?
Well, one answer is simply that I grew up in a very Catholic context. It's a very Catholic town, and my mother was in a convent at one point, and her kind of Catholicism, as we were talking about earlier, is really mystical. She's really driven by signs, wonders, visions, apparitions, coincidence. And so I grew up with a kind of lore about this sort of supernatural spiritual world, which felt inseparable from a kind of magical land that I would fantasize about or read about. And when I was introduced to these mostly medieval female mystics of the Catholic Church, one thing that was so compelling about them was that they were sort of witchy. They seemed like witches to me. And I thought, but they're real. You're told that they're real people, and it kind of opened up a portal into another realm. And also because there were so few female figures in the Catholic Church who had this kind of agency over their own lives, and certainly a spiritual authority over the church. That was really interesting to me. Like, a lot of the men in these contexts seemed to call upon these women for guidance, and that was interesting. And then also because the kinds of divine bliss that they would describe seemed so unimaginably euphoric, and they sort of presented these forms of escape that required no material resources. You didn't need any money or connections or whatever. You could kind of, they presented a world in which you can retreat within yourself, and in order to kind of exit yourself. And that was really compelling to me. Even as a child, I thought I wanted to kind of try to be a mystic when I was really little. I thought maybe I have a chance. My mom seems kind of magical. And then, as I grew older and my criticisms of Catholicism sort of increased, I continued to remain fascinated by these figures and specifically the writing that these people created. And so when this book came to me, I thought it would be it seemed like an opportunity to think about forms of escape and entrapment by creating a character who was not at all religious, but was increasingly drawn to this kind of spiritual, radical experience.
I don't know if this makes sense to you, but while I was reading the first pages of this book and Belinda, I connected with the kind of literature that is being made in South America by Fernanda Melchor and some woman like that. It makes sense to you, this kind of connection? Are you a reader of that kind of literature?
I love Fernanda Melchor, and I love the sort of the whole body of work and tradition that she's participating in. Yeah, she is so good at conjuring these folkloric environments that are also very, very rooted in realism. I mean, there's nothing magical that happens in the books. There's nothing that couldn't happen, and yet you constantly feel like you're in a world where people are sort of perched on the verge of tipping into another world at all times. And also because her prose is so beautiful. I mean, I think I read the translation by Sophie Hughes, which is brilliant. Of course, if you can read Spanish, you should read that. But Sophie Hughes managed to preserve the musicality of her language in this translation. There's this really, really hypnotic effect that the prose has. It's one of the most violent books I've ever read, and yet it's also one of the most beautiful books because of the language, I think. And so yes, I'm always drawn to work that manages this balancing act between a sort of magical, surreal, dreamlike, mythical quality, and then but is anchoring the entire book in a kind of gritty realism.
Yeah, you mentioned the musicality of Melchior or Melchor, we say Melchior novels, but that musicality is here also, and it's also hypnotic because we are dealing with very, very, very hard subjects with lots of humor, but we are going to talk about that later. How is that concern with you, with that musicality in your prose, the way that you deal with language and the balance with these so hard questions that you are writing about?
I mean, for me, the beauty of language is sort of the beginning and end of the writing process for me. It's what drives me to write rather than make TV or there are so many other narrative options. But for me,
we have something.
Yeah. For me, the point of writing is to kind of take what can fiction do that no other form can do. And I'm really drawn to books that are exercising all of the tools of fiction to their maximum capacity. And that can look different for all sorts of books, but books that are exploring interiority and time, staging questions of, I suppose, the relationship between the internal and the external, and certainly language. If a book isn't doing something intentional with language, if they're just using language as a kind of means to an end, I just wonder, why are you writing? You know, why don't you try some other form of expression? So I also think because, you know, there's a poet, an American poet, Deborah Landau, and she wrote a book called Soft Targets. And I used to babysit for her, and so she was about to launch her book, and she was telling me that she was kind of nervous about doing readings from the book because the material was so dark. And it's about, she happened to be in Paris at the time of the terrorist attacks. She was writing about, in the early years of Trump's, I think it was the year that Trump was elected, that this book published, so she's reacting to that, and sort of rise of this new kind of neo-Nazi movement that was happening in the United States around that time that Trump was elected. And yet, when I read the book, of course I saw all of those things, and it never occurred to me that this was a particularly dark or I don't know, a particularly, it never occurred to me that this would be a bummer to read this book because it was so beautiful. And I think sometimes the ecstasy of language itself, or the beauty of language and the beauty of attention can sometimes maybe elevate or transcend the brutality of the subject matter.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that the subject matters. We have here climate change, we have here sexual abuse, we have here political polarization, we have here lots of things that has to do with racism, with exclusion, poverty. You can do that as an essayist, and you make the research for essays. I know about that subject. Why did you choose a novel, and a novel in this form, with the form of this novel, to questioning all these matters?
Well, I never set out to write with a kind of list of material I want to tackle, or even a set of questions. Usually, it's a very subconscious, almost. It's a process that has a lot more in common with dreaming than it does with, for me, with any other form of writing, like writing an essay, for example. You know, I think when you're writing an essay, you sort of shape the narrative to fit the information, and when I'm writing a novel, the narrative shapes the narrative shapes the information. It's sort of like I know what I need to research or include because the narrative is guiding me there. I think, though, you know, it's become sort of popular to insist that one's novel is politically neutral, or that it has no moral agenda at all. And I think that's impossible. I think that's a dishonest position. I think anytime you're attending to someone, anytime you're deciding to vivify a person, a context, a series of experiences, and you're demanding someone else to attend to those things as well, it's a series of ethically freighted decisions. So I tend to trust a very associative logic as I'm drafting, and it's no coincidence that what you care about most will surface if you're drafting with a kind of subconscious logic. So it's sort of like the information emerges as I write, and then I sort of shape the book in dialogue with whatever emerges. But with an essay, of course, you enter it with a plan, with an outline, with a series of things that you'd like to address. And the nature of an essay's arguments is so different from the nature of a kind of novel's arguments. I always write first and foremost as a process of sort of personal discovery, never as an imposition of an argument. So I think both forms have real benefits and real challenges, and this is just always the form that I felt most at home within.
And you talk about all that stuff that is very dark with lots of irony and humor. It's natural to you to do that. How did that occur in the process of writing?
I think I was reading a lot of the American writer Joy Williams at the time, as I mentioned, and David Foster Wallace, and some other writers who are also attending to extreme forms of pain, and writers who suffer a lot in their personal lives. And yet these are the funniest people, I think. I think there's a relationship, there's an extremely inseparable relationship between humor and suffering. And so I think when you're attending to absurdities, when you're trying to defamiliarize things, when you're trying to renew your understanding of something, and when you're trying to access otherwise revealed truths, you often don't know what the result will be tonally. Sometimes it's uncanny, sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's funny. And the only way to for me, the only way to think through tragedies, contemporary tragedies, and other painful, difficult things is to sit with them until the absurdity of it becomes apparent, or to sit with it until a moment of alleviation occurs. I think suffering creates pressure, and pressure creates the need for some kind of release, and humor is often the release that just occurs naturally in the prose.
And these are absurd times, the times we are living in.
Yeah.
It helps.
It does help. You get a lot of good material, yeah. But I think that's probably always been true. You know, I think the work of Shakespeare that I'm most drawn to I love his tragic comedies. I think because there's this sort of live dynamic in the tone. The tone feels alive to me rather than a kind of consistent thing throughout. It feels like it's constantly shifting, and that makes the material kind of come alive.
Mm-hmm. And the form you choose to we have here different voices, different perspectives. We change perspectives. We have I don't know if you can say a protagonist, but she lives in a net, a very complex net of other characters. It was difficult to find the voice or the perspective that you are, because the chapters are divided in the sense of the voice that are speaking. How did you find that form to the book?
Well, I think the form was influenced very directly by my reading. I was reading a lot of books that were structured this way.
So you read while you write?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. I've heard of writers who only read their own work as they write, and it's incomprehensible to me. I think I would lose my mind. But I write like I'm cooking. I kind of have I just pull books off the shelf depending on what I need. I need a little more social expansive realism, Tolstoy. If I need a little more like language-driven, image-driven work, I'll choose a poet. And yeah, I'm often reading mostly poetry, but then also right now I'm reading a lot of thrillers because I need to reacquaint myself with these really fundamental pleasures of reading. And
Why?
You can,
Why?
Because your book can become a very, very dry intellectual exercise if you forget the pleasures of reading. There's a lot of avant-garde fiction that I was introduced to when I was in my early 20s from classes I was taking, and I found that the ones that were successful managed to incorporate elements of traditional realism that I loved, and the ones that I found unsuccessful tended to be efforts to prove how smart the writer was. They seemed to be locking the reader out. They seemed to be almost mocking the idea of pleasure from reading, and even the more experimental writers I love, they tend to, that's not their mission. Their mission is to create a compelling experience. And so if you forget why you fell in love with fiction in the first place, most of us fell in love with fiction as children, and most of the books you're reading as a child are really driven by these fundamental pleasures, like escape, a world that's very magical or interesting to you, a plot that you can't put down, characters that you feel really connected to. So yeah, I find that the more I write, the more important it becomes to incorporate that into my diet.
And the plot is crucial. I mean, when you think about the book, you think first of all in the characters, in the set, or in the plot that you are trying to find while you're writing. I don't know. It's that the sequence.
Well, I think plot is certainly not what drives my fiction. It's not what it's not the thing that I find most compelling now about the writing experience. So, but it is. I don't think it's dispensable. I think like what happens in a book does matter, and it's always informed by the atmosphere, the language, the characters, the themes. But especially when I was revising this book, the series of events that occur, they might not have a kind of causal relationship the way that a traditional sort of 3-act structure of a movie would have a causal relationship between events. But that didn't mean that the relationship between the events was insignificant to me. It was just as significant. It's just that I had to kind of switch my. I thought of them more as I mentioned earlier. I thought of them as existing almost visually with each other rather than in terms of cause and effect. So there was a certain balance I was always trying to achieve, a certain composition I was always trying to achieve. And yeah, it turns out that the plot is just another tool that you can't dispense with.
So what came first here? It was the characters or Vaca Valley?
Definitely the place. The place. I felt like my only, really one of the very few things I knew I wanted to do early on was capture this feeling that I had, this sensation that I had in my town and so many towns that were similar, which was a sensation of waiting and longing and a sort of ambient haunting. And then the structure maybe came to me second. I knew I was really interested in the experiment of inviting many voices and many storylines. And then Joan was the first character who arrived. Joan. Yeah.
Can you talk about, because there are people here, persons here that didn't read the book.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about
Joan? Yeah. I had just listened to an interview with someone who moderated comments on an obituary website for a living, and I was really fascinated by that job.
So you wrote first the obituary. It was the first thing.
The first scene I think was that I wrote was a conversation that Joan has with her boss when she fails to delete an offensive comment. She has failed to delete an offensive comment off of an obituary, and her boss is confronting her about it. And so I was reading a lot of obituary comments, guest books online, and especially of like some semi-public figures, people who weren't celebrities, but had some kind of following. And yeah, the kind of collective subconscious revelations there were so extreme and compelling and unexpected that I thought I have to spend more time in this space. And then I think that kind of introduced the tone and the sort of color palette.
Yeah, the tone. That gives you the tone. It makes sense.
I think it was the thing that determined the kind of the color palette of the book.
So a celebrity writes her own obituary before she died, of course. And then the place. And the place, there are rich people, poor people, people more or less, medium, all kind of classes. That diversity that we don't are used to think when you think about a place in the Rust Belt, the Rust Belt. I'm sorry, I have problems in my throat. But you mentioned that in other interviews that you find that there is no literature, almost no literature about that kind of region of U.S. Why do you think there is that?
Well, I think there certainly is some, but it is underrepresented. I think part of it is that it's a region of America that is designed. I think the one aspect is that it was colonized a bit later than the coasts were, and so it kind of didn't participate in the American mythologies about itself.
The American dream?
It certainly suffers from the American dream.
Mythology.
Yeah, but that mythology of sort of like going out west and finding gold, or going, kind of the early colonists of the East Coast. I think that there are certain American mythologies that were formed in the earliest stages of the country's violent colonialization, and Indiana was mostly forest until the mid-1800s. So it obviously had a history, but it wasn't maybe as formative or central to America's conception of itself as some of these older places. But it's also, I think, because it's frankly just a place where it's a place of strip malls and abandoned factories, and it's really divested of beauty. I think that when you're facing economic decline, beauty is sort of the first thing to go. And I think there is sublime and jagged beauty that you can find there, but it's certainly not an obvious kind of beauty. And so I think a lot of people just ask, why would anyone want to spend time in a place so mundane, so car dependent? It seems like an unlikely site of narrative, but I think that's exactly what I'm drawn to in it. And I think that now, even when I'm setting my fiction elsewhere, that's the kind of landscape I'm looking for, one that's not an obvious, glamorous setting.
And that forms you, I guess, growing up in a place like that forms you as a person and also as a writer. But you want to start to write this book while you were living in New York. That distance was important to start to write this?
Yes, I don't think I could have written the book without leaving. I mean, when I was in college, I went to a university that was in my hometown, so I hadn't really left yet. And I did write one novella that was sort of took place in Indiana. It was like it was supposed to take place in Purgatory, but it was really inspired by Gary, Indiana, which is another city in Indiana. So I tried then. That was my first attempt, and then and then when I left, I think you can see things much more clearly when you leave. And it's almost like I once heard this advice from a writer. Maybe it was advice actually that I heard from someone in film, that you learn as much as you can about the subject, especially if you're trying to depict a real event or person, and then you try to forget everything, and then during the performance, what you need will surface, and I think it's a way to sort of kill your darlings. And the same thing happened when I left. Like, when I left, the details that I needed, the salient details, all of those surfaced, all of those became apparent. And when I was there, you just feel a little bit more maybe beholden to the real life people around you. You feel a little more overwhelmed by the specificity of what you're seeing, the kind of surplus of information and details that you could pull from. And with distance, you can, just the important things will come back.
And how the purgatory affects this book. This is the book after purgatory? We passed the purgatory, or we are in there?
I think it's still a phase of purgatory, maybe. I thought about this. I had this religion teacher when I was 10. I went to Catholic school, and she was the one who taught us the term purgatory, and she was a really eccentric lady. She would kind of throw chalk at us, and she would give us...
This is a Catholic country, so you can go on.
You know how it is, yeah. She was not a nun, but she was in a convent at one point. She left. She was in her 60s at this point, and she'd often talk about how attractive her husband was, and we were children, and we were confused by all of it. But so she was a really eccentric figure. But she was kind of known for these very, very literal interpretations of Catholic doctrine, and I guess one day she just decided to tell us about purgatory, and we'd never heard of it. We'd heard of heaven, we'd heard of hell. She said purgatory was the place you go to when you're not quite bad enough for hell, but you're not good enough for heaven. And she said basically everyone ends up there. So, she made it sound really easy to end up there. She said, let's say you go to the priest and all of your sins are forgiven, and then you have a bad thought, and then you're hit by a car on your way out of the church. You're going to purgatory. And she described it as this. She also said that it wasn't...
it's like hell.
Yeah, it sounded bad. We were but she said it was this place of eternal longing and unquenchable thirst. I remember her saying, imagine you're so thirsty and you can never drink water. And we were and she made us memorize this prayer called the Prayer to St. Gertrude, and she said it liberates exactly 1,000 souls from purgatory every time it's said. The souls are chosen randomly. And she would be think of your grandparents, they're stuck there until you say. So she'd calculate the number of souls that we released every day on the blackboard, and then at the end of the year she would announce the grand total, which was always this incomprehensibly large number. And so we were bewildered by the whole thing. But I think something that kind of stayed with me was that her description of purgatory sounded so familiar to me. I thought, we live there. That's our house. This is what it feels like to walk around Indiana. And so when I was writing this book, around the time that I was preparing for publication in America, I just suddenly remembered this teacher and this prayer, and I kind of realized this was a kind of secular prayer to people in earthly purgatories. This was a kind of earthly purgatory that I was trying to conjure. And of course, the etymology of purgatory, it's about purging. So I think one of the things that draws me to this landscape is that it's a place where everything's kind of at the surface, everything's visible, all of the darkness, the sins, the complexity, it's all there in plain sight for everyone to kind of look at. So I think, I do think this is a kind of purgatory still.
Yeah, this is very. Yesterday, I was reading the obituary of Alice Munro, and she says something like, "Only the people who lives in a small places know that there's everything. The small places has everything that you need to understand the complexity of the world." Do you agree with this idea, being from a place like that?
I do. I think you can probably. I think there are certain layers of privilege and protection from realities that can maybe blind you to the world. But I do think that pretty much every place on Earth has the potential to reveal, everything that you need to know, everything that you need to know about life.
But for instance, your friends in New York, how did they look at this place, like an exotic place? Or?
Yeah. I had a lot of friends who were from also kind of smaller places or from rural areas or poorer areas, and so I think they understand kind of immediately. And then people who have only ever lived in big cities, I think there's sometimes people simply dismiss it. There's a bit of condescension, I think, toward this whole region of America, not from everyone, but certainly you do encounter it on the coasts much more than you encounter it anywhere else. Like, I don't know if I can't remember if I told you this story, but when I was living in New York, I went to the New York Philharmonic. They were doing a performance of Ravel, and there was a woman seated beside me. She was in furs. She was like a native Manhattanite. She could you felt like she never left Manhattan except for to go to Europe, and she maybe never went to Brooklyn, and
yes,
you could picture her. You can see her, right? Like, she has a little dog. It's fluffy. It's been inbred for so many generations that it has like an allergy to air. And she said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Indiana," and she gasped, and she said, "I didn't know anyone was actually from Indiana."
Oh.
And she said, "Did you turn the lights off when you left?" And it was kind of a good zinger, It was a good line. And then my favorite thing about this lady, which has nothing to do with this story, is when they started playing Bolero, she got up and huffed out of the room and said, "Who needs to hear this again?" But yeah, you would sometimes that was the most dramatic version of this, but that was the attitude you did sometimes encounter.
Oh my God, you are from Indiana.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nobody's from there.
You mentioned the language and the rhythm of the book, and I guess there is a music in the book, a kind of I don't know. It's not a tone. It's a rhythm, I guess, because your sentences are long. Your words are very. I don't know. You must. The sense is that you choose each word to make a kind of sound. How is your relation with writing and music?
Well, I used to sing a lot, and I'm from a family of
musicians. You sing the sentences of the book?
Yes, I actually am making this into a musical as we speak, yeah. It was funny, because when the film rights were optioned, you have to sign this crazy contract that says that they have rights to the theme park and the musical, and I thought, good luck, go for it. But yeah, my brothers are all musicians, and they would write music. And my mom was a visual artist, a painter, and at one point she won a grant to build an art studio onto our house. And she didn't tell my dad that she had proposed that he would do all of the labor. So it was a very small amount of money, actually, but somehow, my dad used to work in construction, so he could do it. But my brothers helped if they could add on a little music studio as they were at it. So there was this summer when I was 12 where the whole house was kind of a construction site, and everyone was always dropping hammers on each other, and so they were always making music in my house, and it was just such a fundamental part of my childhood. And as I mentioned before, I'm a very auditory learner. I always remember how something sounded before I remember how it looked. So I think I have a kind of a particular sensitivity to the sounds and textures of language, and it ends up mattering a lot to me when I'm writing. So thank you to the translator. I feel like it's a really incredible thing when you find a translator who can preserve all of those choices, because they are very intentional, and the texture of language changes, of course, if you're trying to preserve a literal interpretation. So there are a million choices to make when you're translating, for the same reason. But yeah, the sound matters a lot to me.
And poetry, I guess you mentioned in all interviews and in another conversation that you need absolutely to learn and to feel inspired by poetry to write. What is the connection between poetry and your prose?
Well, I think it's poetry has to be so efficient. It has to conjure a whole world of associations and emotional experiences by offering very few images and very intentional language. And so maybe one of the reasons I read poetry and maybe like more plot-driven fiction when I'm writing, rather than novels that I would normally gravitate toward, is because they're both extreme versions of what I'm trying to reach. I'm trying to reach this extremely intentional, kind of mysterious alchemy with language, and I'm also trying to make a compelling story. So I think poetry it just wakes my brain up in a way that nothing else does. It's the good poetry, it's sort of like my friend who is very articulate normally, he encountered this poetry, the contemporary poem, and he just said, "What is that? Where do I get more of that?" It's almost like a drug, it's almost like you kind of revert back into a creature or an animal when you encounter art that's so good it kind of exceeds, you can't even describe what's happening inside your brain as you encounter it. That's how I feel.
Can you give us some examples of poets
Poets I love? Yeah, Yusef Komunyakaa is an American poet I love. There's Morgan Parker and Tommy Pico, Natalie Diaz, Ocean Vuong. I love Frank O'Hara. He's one of obviously, a poet I think has influenced some of the other contemporary poets I really love. Megan Fernandez, Kaveh Akbar. Most of these are American poets.
Are you taking notes?
I could come up with a whole, Ariana Reigns, I could come up with a list. But I would love to read more. I think I came to contemporary poetry later. I was in my 20s when I first started to really read it, and I'm still discovering a lot more. And I would especially love to read more poetry in translation, because most of these books were written in English.
And you never wanted to be a poet, like almost of the novelists?
I did. I do write a lot of poetry. I don't. Maybe it's
you write.
Like I do, but I think maybe everyone has something that's some form that's like they revere too much to do themselves, to publish themselves, or maybe it's like I have too much respect for poetry. I don't know what it is. I did when I took a poetry class in college. I remember originally I kind of felt that poetry was the poetry that I was writing was very like riddle-esque, and it was kind of, how can I like cloak my meaning more and more and more? And then when I was exposed to really good poetry, you realize it's the opposite is true. Like, how can you, what's the direct line into the meaning? And so I would love to write it, but I find often I actually write my fiction in verse, not like in formal verse, but in terms of line breaks, because it puts a lot of pressure on each line. I want each line to be doing many jobs at once, but then I end up deleting the line breaks because they are essentially random. they don't have any meaning. But it helps me, it helps me create that kind of effect in language that I am looking for.
Mm-hmm. This is your first novel. It took you 5 years to write. It was rejected from many publishers.
I actually was so beaten down by all the other rejections. I didn't submit this to anyone until a friend.
Until this. So,
yeah.
So I was dealing with the rejection. It must be awful. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's awful.
It's
Yeah.
awful.
It's bad, yeah. Wouldn't recommend it. I mean, yeah, so I was writing this for about 5 years. I've been writing fiction forever, since I was little, but
This was a secret. You keep
this one was
as a
my
secret.
project that I
Okay.
didn't show anyone. Yeah, this was the project because I had this other novel and I had a short story collection and I had drafted a couple novellas and all of those I finished before I finished this one. So I was submitting those projects around to agents and contests and editors and yeah, each time usually the rejections were encouraging, but they kind of said like even if they liked it, they just didn't see a place in the market for my writing. And I guess I just, by the time I finished this novel, that had become so depressing to me. And you're told, I don't know how, if, I know in France, people don't typically have agents. I don't know how it is in Portugal. Do they? Yeah, it's, the process in America is kind of, you have to get an agent first, and then the agent will submit to editors, and then the editor will, you'll find an editor to publish. So you're told that you only have like one chance with each agent, and if you blow it, then that's it. You'll never have another chance with that agent, which is not true. I don't know why everyone tells you this, but that meant that by the time I finished this book, I thought, well, I don't want to blow my chance with the remaining agents on my list. I just put this on my shelf. I'll print it out really nicely, and I'll bind it at a printing shop, and I will move on and write something else. But I found that I couldn't write anything like normal. I was thinking, why am
What
I?
is normal?
Yeah, what is normal, and why?
It's one of the subjects in the book.
Yeah, it is. That's true. Yeah, I never really thought
Normal
about that.
versus abnormal. What is that?
Yeah, and I thought, why write at all? Why write fiction at all if you can't write what you're driven to write? I mean, there aren't a lot of other rewards. There certainly aren't a lot of material rewards. So, you've got to be doing it because you love what you're writing, first and foremost. So I was complaining to a friend, and she's the one who convinced me to submit it to agents. And then when Jonathan found out that I'd submitted it, he intervened. And John Safenfauer, he said, I'm going to tell them to read your book, because they often just don't have time to read all the books that they receive. And then things happened quickly. But it was, it was really, really shocking to me, because all of the other writing I'd been doing had been received with a kind of unilateral,
And
this
that
is too
word,
weird.
this is weird.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That's a good
Weird?
question. I don't know. I'd love to ask them. Because
It's
also
not supposed to be original anymore?
I don't know. I mean, I found that now that impression of publishing was not quite correct. Like actually, now that I have met publishers around the world and readers around the world and critics, like I find that the world of literary fiction is actually extremely risk forward. I find that it's like the kinds of books being celebrated are ones that are taking risks, that are really unusual or in some way challenging a norm. And of course, nothing is totally new. There's always a precedent. But I find that most people who are reading literary fiction have an appetite for books that are challenging them, that are asking something of them, that are collaborating with their imaginations and respecting the reader by offering them something it's not pre-digested for you. I think that impression of the literary world was really incorrect, actually. I find that it's a place that's really motivated by all the right things. And maybe you just have to find the right fit. You just have to find the right publisher who understands you, the right agent who understands you, and then they know how to bring others to the book.
Mm-hmm. And it's not possible to read this book this year, not as also a political novel. There is a very funny moment here where Tiffany or Belinda, I don't know, is arguing with the man that abuses her, exposing a Marxist theory, something like that. It's a very crazy moment here. But Indiana is a swing state. We are dealing with a town that could be a kind of place that reflects all the complexity of a country or even in the world. How's that? How's Indiana as a state and as a state that represents that complexity of America as a swing state?
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of, it's hard to remember sometimes that it's a swing state because it has become so conservative in the last few years.
But it has a governor that was a gay.
The mayor of my
The
town,
mayor,
yeah,
yes, the mayor.
Pete Buttigieg, who ran for president.
Yes.
Yeah, he was the mayor of my town, and he was a Democrat, and he's a really, actually, I loved his campaign because he was able to, I think because he worked in this environment where he had to constantly be negotiating between political parties, he was able to package ideas in a way that was actually palatable and receptive to more conservative voters. He was also one of the only candidates who was rethinking, kind of trying to challenge the political system. He was trying to rethink the Supreme Court justice system. He was trying to rethink the Electoral College, which makes it not a true democracy, and gerrymandering. He was proposing a lot of what he called tune-ups to our democracy, and nobody else was really talking about that at the time. But yeah, I mean, Indiana it also produced Mike Pence, who, you know who that is. And then also Amy Coney Barrett was from my hometown, who's now a justice on the Supreme Court, who was one of the kind of architects of the...
How many people lived in your town?
Yeah, there's just us four, actually,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny, it was having like a moment where I was like, what is going on? Everyone is from South, no one had ever heard of South Bend, and then suddenly everyone was in the government. But yeah, it's a place of extremes, and I think, as I was saying before, like when I was coming into political consciousness around the age of 15, I was like, Obama had won, and I know that my brother and his girlfriend had been like campaigning for Obama, and they'd involved me in that, and I just felt so hopeful about the state of everything. Obama had won Indiana, I mean, and then I think that America is a pendulum. I think it reacts to progress by regressing even further back, and then hopefully it swings a little further, and then so it's like, you know, I think that the legacy of there are several forces that kind of force people or push people toward a figure like Trump. And one of them, the only one that I feel like I can kind of understand or relate to, is just a desire to sort of burn it all down. I think a lot of people just want to start over, and they think let's just vote for the most incendiary candidate. And of course, I don't agree with that logic. I don't think they'll like the way that he burns everything down, but I think that is something that most people in America are looking for at this point. I think the one thing that everyone can agree on is like the system is broken. Indiana, I think this year I think this election it'll vote for Trump. I'm certain that Indiana will vote for Trump, and I think Trump will win. But my only hope at this point is to change our democracy, because the majority of people actually, he won't win the popular vote. He never did. He never will. But as long as we have this compromised version of democracy, a minority of conservative extremists can get what they want, and they can rig the system in their favor. And we see this happening around the world. It's not just in America. But yeah, I don't feel super hopeful right now about politics in Indiana.
Let's talk about rabbits.
Rabbits, okay, yeah.
So, the book in English, the original, you can read it.
The Rabbit Hutch.
The Rabbit Hutch. In Portuguese, it's o contrário de nada, the contrary of nothing, the opposite of nothing. Why did you have this fixation in rabbits? And then we will ask Eugenia the reason why she gave another title in Portuguese, or so different title. I don't have nothing to do with that.
So the title...
That's rabbits here. There are rabbits here.
There are a lot of rabbits, yeah. Yeah, the title in English came from, so most of the characters live in an affordable housing complex, and I guess the idea for that was that it was an old building that used to house factory workers, like often a kind of tenement housing style factory housing. And there's an initiative in the town to transform it into affordable housing, and there's this wonky donor who wants to donate enough money to help this project happen, but he also wants it to sound chic. So he decides to give it a French name. The building gets a French name, and he chooses an antiquated French word, la lapinière, which means rabbit warren or rabbit hutch. Although when I went to France, everyone was like, I've never heard that word before in my life. So it's a very antiquated term. But it was something that just appeared in an early draft, and there were rabbits everywhere in an early draft, and I didn't really know why. And I try not to interrogate too closely until I have a full draft. But when I watched this documentary called Roger and Me in the early stages of this book. It's by Michael Moore. And he's from Flint, Michigan, which is a town very, very similar to mine, except it suffered much more radically from post-industrial neglect. And there's a scene in the documentary, which was made in the 80s, where he sees a sign on the side of the road, and it says, "Rabbits, pets, or meat." And he goes to investigate, and he finds a woman named Rhonda Britton who had lost her job, and she'd taken to breeding rabbits for a living. And she says something in the course of a conversation that struck me. It sort of stopped me in my tracks, and it became the epigraph of the book. I'll just read it to you since I have the English version right here. So she's pointing to these rabbits, all these rabbits in a cage. She's divided them for pets and meat. She says, if you don't sell them as pets, you got to get rid of them as meat. Them guys are all meat, but see, they start doing this to each other. And she points to the rabbits. What's that? Asks Michael Moore. Peeing on each other and stuff like that when they get older. If you don't have 10 separate cages for them, then they start fighting. Then the males castrate the other males. They do. They chew their balls right off. Then you have a bloody mess. That's why you got to butcher them when they get a certain age, or you have a heck of a mess. And aside from being just like an extremely violent image, it was striking to me because it seemed like this perfect parable for horizontal violence, which is a term I first encountered, I think, from Frantz Fanon, the anti-colonial theorist, to describe rage that's directed at the oppressor, at the colonizer from the oppressed group. But because the colonizer tends to barricade themselves in this kind of fortress of power and privilege and protection, the rage can never reach its proper target, but it has to go somewhere, so it often laterally misfires into the oppressed group. And it seemed to me that when I was trying to understand how structural violence and neglect create interpersonal violence and neglect, this image of creatures trapped within a cage, trying to get out of the cage, but they can't, and so they attack each other, it just seemed to encapsulate the kind of root of every form of violence in the book. But I am drawn to rabbits because I think because they evoke a lot of conflicting associations. Like there's the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, but there's also Donnie Darko and Playboy and the Easter Bunny and their pets and their meat. And I think because of this, they're sort of perched between innocence and corruption, and that interested me. I liked the idea of sort of evoking all of those associations at once.
Let's ask before open to the audience. Why the title change in Portuguese?
Hello. Thank you so much for this conversation. I must say that Eugenia opposed to the changing of the title. She was very fierce about it. She made a whole argument. But the thing is that the Rabbit Hutch in English has this sound, and you are very interested in sound. See, agora? So the Rabbit Hutch in English has a particular sound, and it's very in spite of speaking about this reality that you described, it is elegant. It is an elegant expression. In Portuguese, it would be a colheira, which is an odd word for us. It has, like La Lapinière, this ancient image. Nobody knows very well what a rabbit hutch is. And what I felt was that if it had the original title, as it's your first novel and the whole thing we spoke before, maybe it wouldn't meet the right readers. And so The Opposite of Nothing is the title of the first chapter. That's what we decided to. We had other options, but then I thought that The Opposite of Nothing is a very fair title for this novel because it's something that encapsulates everything that the novel is, because it's the opposite of a common novel, the opposite of an expected novel. So it was. I was very sure that the title should be different in Portuguese, just because the word in Portuguese doesn't match the sound of it in English.
Yeah.
So Eugenia disagrees.
Are you convinced, Eugenia?
No, I am, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But she said coelheira with the accent of Lisbon.
You asked why the French title was also different. Yeah, so in French it's Écoutez-moi jusqu'à la fin, which is also a chapter title. It's their translation of Hear Me Out. But this kind of shocked me. It turned out that in France they had government housing that was called the rabbit housing base. It wasn't La Lapinière, it was like another translation of that, but they called it essentially like rabbit home.
We have it in Portuguese.
Oh my gosh.
Not rabbits, but for chickens.
Ah.
So we also have that
A similar
image. Yes.
Yeah. Right, and they thought, I just had, I mean, it's really astonishing. Like I thought but I think, yeah, they didn't want to evoke that because in English it would have been like calling my book The Projects or something, which, it's not doing the same work that this title is trying to do. And so, yeah, I've actually really loved the alternate titles that, I love The Opposite of Nothing, actually. And, obviously, people will be like, isn't that everything? But in the chapter, I guess one of the things that chapter is trying to evoke is this experience of divine ecstasy. And one thing that every medieval mystic describes, like actually this is consistent across descriptions of divine ecstasy across religions and time periods, and even from secular kind of descriptions. There's a kind of ego death that everyone describes, which is also obviously associated with psychedelics. And there's this consistent description of a kind of unity with absolutely every person, being, object, life form, time period, a collapse of all boundaries between life forces. And it seems to me that this description isn't quite the same as everything. It's like that everything implies a material nature, a finite material nature. And actually what they're describing, there really is no word for it, at least not in English. And I've never encountered a word for it in another language, which is, a kind of total. Actually, there's a term by Simone Weil, which gets closest. She's a mystic, actually, that Blondine quotes a lot. She calls it decreation, which is, in her words, the undoing of the creature in us. And that's the closest correlation. But she invented that word. And there's actually an amazing book by Anne Carson called Decreation, in which one of the essays is about that term by Simone Weil. So, yeah, I like that. I like the title, Portuguese.
Now let's open to the audience. Questions? Over there.
Is this thing on? Oh. Is it a go? Yeah, okay. Hi. First, thanks for the novel. I had a great time reading it. It surprised me. It made me laugh as well. Great page turner and everything. It's because you just spoke about Simone Weil, and today you spoke about beauty and the beauty of attention. And there was a Facebook post by Madalena recently that directed me towards this the video of your speech in the National Book Award, where you have this line of something like attention, our most sacred resource. So if you could talk a bit about what I have two questions actually. So if you can hold this one, attention to you, and then the kind of work maybe beyond Simone Weil, which is an obvious reference in the book, but like in the book, ways in which you're trying to talk or get us to think about attention. The second question, if I'm allowed, would be the talk about the city in purgatory. There's this a short story that we read in class with my students have read it too. By Charles Baxter. It's called The Disappeared. It's not a very well-known story. It's from 1990. But it's all about the Rust Belt. But it's radically different in terms of style from your writing. But there the focus, well, historically grounded in the 90s, is on rust. It's on being derelict. But it's got the limbo thing, and it's got this mystical ending too, like very apocalyptic. At the end that you might find interesting to read. But I'm interested in the move from that Rust Belt into the way you're operating it in your book. There's this character, Pinky, is it? Like where Blandine wants to like do this punk lynching and this revamping of the Rust Belt, because that's something completely. I was looking at this academic book of Pennsylvania and ads that were coming out like already in the 21st century of trying to redesign. If you could talk to us about that move, you know, this kind of revamping of the Rust Belt from your experience and what it's trying to do, how you felt. Okay.
Yeah. I guess I'll answer the first question about attention first. So there's the line from Simone Weil that I think about all the time. I think I first read it when I was about 20. She says, "To know that this man who is hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that is enough, the rest will follow." And I think about that all the time, and I quote it all the time, because it is kind of fundamental to my understanding of fiction's purpose as well. It's in Simone Weil's conception, merely paying radical attention to someone else is a transformative act. And I think the best fiction alchemizes other people into fully realized, fully vivified experiences. I think that one of the reasons that there's been this wave of book bans in America is that, I guess you're told all the time that literature, specifically literary fiction, is dead, dying, done. This has been going on for a long time. And yet, people are still very afraid of it. These kind of arbiters of systemic oppression are very afraid of literature. I think because the good literature, you enter it from a place of absolute identification, which is really different from the way that you enter any other experience of any other art. You are completely aligned with the characters, the narrator, and then you're collaborating. The novel in your mind is completely different from the novel in someone else's mind. And that creates a kind of complicity or a kind of equal participation in the creation of a book. So I think that now that attention has literally become commodified, and we obviously live in a kind of attention extraction economy, now that there are demands coming from our pocket directly into our brainstem, I think that attention is probably a more valuable resource than it's ever been. And it becomes very, very difficult to mistreat someone when you pay very close attention to them, when you understand the forces that are operating within and upon them. So that's a little bit of what I think about attention. But I also, to your second question about the Rust Belt and revitalization campaigns specifically, there was a campaign in Michigan, which my town was right on the border of Michigan. There was a campaign in Michigan when I was in high school they called it Pure Michigan, and they would have these really sentimental commercials with piano over the radio, and Tim Allen, I don't know if you know the actor, he was the voice of it. He's not from Michigan, but he was the voice of those commercials. And he was always describing this extremely wholesome, like, take your kids to the lake, and then there'd be like piano, and it'd be like showing like a golden retriever, like merrily bounding through water, and people would be like at a restaurant grilling, and it seemed to me like these commercials were almost creepily American. Like it was like presenting a very particular American vision of prosperity and happiness. There'd always be like a family, I don't know. But then also sometimes, once in a while, I would feel extremely moved by these commercials. Like I don't know. I had a kind of experience that I gave to one of my characters in this book. I worked at a bakery throughout my high school, and if I was really tired or emotional or something, and one of these commercials would come on, sometimes I'd find myself tearing up, and I was like, why is this happening? I know this is bullshit. But I think it's because it did also kind of offer a vision of life that had been foreclosed. That had never been available to any of the people who actually lived in these places. So those campaigns are happening throughout the Rust Belts. There was one in my own town where they were trying to make it into a kind of Silicon Valley. It had to do with like weather and fiber optic cable. For some reason, our town was particularly suited to startups. And so when Pete Buttigieg was mayor, he was trying to kind of pull in business. But he's not as nefarious, not nearly as nefarious as all of these developers are. I think that right now, a bunch of kind of mid-sized to smaller towns across America are being reimagined. And we'll see what happens.
I just wondering if in Brazil, is there a title for the novel?
I don't think it's published in Brazil yet.
I know.
Oh, no, but you can feel free to give it a...
Because as they also speak Portuguese, I'd like to know if you are going to maintain the same title or changing for Brazil.
I don't know. Do you distribute in Brazil?
No.
Do you? Okay. Yeah, I think it would have to be a separate publisher. So I would love to, I'd love to publish in Brazil. But I guess to answer your question about titles, typically the author doesn't have much control over, I mean, you have say, you get to, they ask you, they don't just change it. And usually I'm really on board with it, but it's usually the publisher that just knows their market and knows their language better. So they are the ones who propose. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I'm working on another novel, and it's changing so radically day to day that I don't even feel like I can describe it. But it's due in October, so I have to figure it out. But it's called Honeydew, and I guess some of the things that I've been interested in lately have to do with quantum superposition, which is something that I feel like a lot of people know about, but I came to very late. And once I learned about it, I was like, why is this not breaking news? We should all know about this. But basically, it's this experiment that I came upon years ago about, it's called the double slit experiment. And if you haven't encountered this before, it's actually way easier if you just see a visual representation of it. So if you just YouTube the double slit experiment, you'll see it's an experiment that's been conducted many, many, many times in quantum mechanics that essentially proves that when electrons are being observed, they behave like particles, and when they're not being observed, they behave like waves. And this seems to disrupt pretty much fundamental notions of reality, as so many things in quantum mechanics do. So I was trying to kind of take that concept as a jumping off point for a reality where lives start diffracting into potentials when there's no one left to observe the person in question.
Hi, thank you for being here. Thank you for this encounter. Obrigado, Isabel. I haven't read your book. When I found out I was coming here, I ordered it, but couldn't find it available. But I'm really, really happy and looking forward to reading it. When Isabel spoke about Jonathan Safran Foer and David Foster Wallace, T.S. Eliot, I felt you were the less weird person on earth. I felt like I had already started reading you, and I'm really happy to read. Congratulations on your choice of reading. I really enjoyed it. And I'm about 19 years older than you. It took me back to something from before you were born, which is Twin Peaks by David Lynch. Back when America was really, really interesting and full of really intelligent and wonderful storytellers like yourself. I was very pleased because I've been kind of guilty pleasuring on watching the Trump trials, and it's really refreshing to find out that real people are still on the other side.
Oh, yeah.
And when you talked about your story, Purgatory, and you made an analogy to Purge, which I hadn't come on before, and you made that analogy of the balance, people wanting to burn it all down, and for the first time in a long time, it made sense to me, a bit of what might be happening in America. And I was wondering, when you write, is there something that you would like to happen to people who read your books?
I'm already transformed.
Thank you for your question. You know, the truth is that when I write, I actually can't write if I'm thinking about audience. I think that I get frozen and I start to, I think for somebody, you know, any of us who have an instinct to please people, that can be really toxic in your writing. You need to be sort of beholden to no one but yourself. But I do have a kind of imaginary, like, extra consciousness that I feel is present, which is I always imagine that there is someone reading it who's smarter than I am, more interesting than I am.
An ideal reader.
Yeah, just someone whose inner life is so rich and complex and fascinating that I am competing with it for the person's attention, but I'm also collaborating with it. And so I don't tend to think about effects that I want to have on readers, but I do think a lot about maybe the moment-to-moment impacts of language on my own consciousness. You know, you don't really. There's one theory about why consciousness evolved that says it was a kind of evolutionary advantage, because once you understand what you're thinking, once you understand your motives, and you can become aware of your own desires, fears, etc., then you have a better chance of predicting other people's desires, fears, etc., and that helps you in a social context. And sometimes I think about the way that the experience of writing is similarly, like the only chance I have of maybe even reaching or imagining a reader is by engaging with my own response to the work. So first and foremost, I'm trying to challenge and surprise myself. And if I'm not doing that, I have no chance of challenging or surprising anyone else. And as I revise, I guess I'm much more aware of trying to create an experience that's very intentional and refined. But yeah, I think one of the pleasures of publishing and meeting readers is that the book kind of has different, really radically different impacts on different people. And people, resonate with different scenes, different characters, different aspects. So, I like kind of preserving the sacred individuality of each reading experience.
Hi. First, thank you. Like we've all said, this was very interesting and we really like to hear about your book. I was wondering about the writing process itself, because you said you took 5 years to finish the book, and I was wondering what that's like, how much change the book went through, and how you finally figured out that this is it, this is my book.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the fundamental nature of the book arrived to me in the first summer that I wrote it. I mean, that often happens, like a lot arrives at once and then it takes years to figure out the rest. And I was writing, and I would go to this park near my apartment every morning, and I'd leave my phone and all my electronics, and I would just read and sketch by hand, sort of ideas, lines, characters. And so that was kind of the early phase, and then I kind of do that until it either got too hot or I would just be so inspired by whatever I was reading that I was kind of like running back to my apartment to start typing. And then I'm someone who revises incrementally. I revise pretty much every day when I start a writing session. And there's this book by George Saunders, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. Some of you have seen it. It's a kind of craft textbook about the Russian short stories that he teaches in his creative writing classrooms. And he makes this argument for incremental revision that really resonated with my own practice, which is, he says, when you revise little by little every day, consistently you bring every self to the revision. You bring the hungry self, the self that just had that transcendent conversation, the self that just read that article, and that can be kind of, the sum of those selves is greater than the 1 or 2 passes that you could do all at once. And I think that's true for me. But I also think it was important over time to sort of spend months working on something else and leaving this in a drawer so that it would be refreshed. And then in terms of changes, like I think there weren't. The changes happened so gradually that there wasn't a big like overhaul at any point. A lot got cut. That was probably the biggest change. At one point, I made note cards of each scene in the book, and like the location, the characters, and I posted them around my bedroom, and sort of lived within the structure of the novel when I had about 3/4 of it drafted, and that really helped me see what needed to be cut, see what needed to be added. And you do kind of feel like a mad detective who's like gone rogue off the case after a while. You're like making connections. You're like, oh, and this needs to go here. And you're sort of, it's sort of a compositional project. It's really a very animal intuitive. For me, it was a very animal intuitive process, but it did help me figure out like what I needed where. And then that's when the ending sort of started forming for me. But the editing that I did with my editor on this book was fairly light, but the one thing that he did suggest was adding a few more touches of light and tenderness. He said there has to be one sex scene where people are just having a good time, and it was a really good piece of advice. And also just a few moments of kind of kindness or tenderness. So there were a few scenes that I added in that process. But how do you know when it's done? I mean, I tend to think that, I said this earlier to someone, there's this quote that a novel is never done, it's merely abandoned. And I do think you could kind of revise indefinitely, you could add indefinitely. But at one point I realized that I was making it worse, and I could no longer kind of see the forest for the trees, and I felt that I was maybe like draining the energy from the book. And at that point, when I thought, I don't know how to make this better anymore, I feel that it can still be made better, but I need some other person to guide me. That's when I decided to submit it.
I guess our time is over, and thank you so much for
Thank you.
being here, Tess.
Thanks for your questions. They're really beautiful. And thank you so much for being here.
And Tess is going. Tess is going to sign some books. I don't know, there or there? There.